Hello, I'm Dave Taylor from Conspirators.com. Welcome to Dry Tortugas National Park, an isolated group of keys located 68 miles west of Key West, Florida. In July of 1865, 4 men convicted of assisting in the murder of Abraham Lincoln were sent here to serve out prison terms. Their place of confinement was this structure behind us, Fort Jefferson, made of 16 million bricks. My wife Jen and I are going to spend 3 nights camping within the shadow of Fort Jefferson. Join us as we experience history firsthand, exploring the fort and discussing what life was like for the Lincoln conspirators here at the Dry Tortugas.
The Dry Tortugas are a collection of small island keys located in the Gulf of Mexico. They were named after the plethora of sea turtles which once filled the crystal clear waters, and the fact that there was no fresh water to be found. Originally claimed by the Spanish, the area became part of the United States when Spain ceded Florida to the U.S. in 1819. At that time, there were a total of 11 keys that made up the Tortugas. All are sand keys, composed of coral sand situated on top of prehistoric reef formations. Over the years, 4 of the 11 keys have disappeared. Some disappeared gradually through erosion and sea level rise, while others were quickly washed out due to hurricanes and tropical storms. Visitors to the Dry Tortugas spend the majority of their time on Garden Key, the island on which Fort Jefferson was built. Adjacent to Garden Key is Bush Key, which is open part of the year when migratory birds are not laying their eggs there. The other publicly accessible island as part of the Dry Tortugas is Loggerhead Key, which is located 3 miles to the west. This is the largest of all of the keys in the Dry Tortugas and has a sizable lighthouse. The remaining 4 inaccessible islands of the Dry Tortugas are little more than sandbars reaching above the waves. They consist of Long Key, Hospital Key, Middle Key, and East Key.
Fort Jefferson was built on Garden Key, the second largest key in the Dry Tortugas. But to illustrate the dynamic and ever-changing way of nature, I'm currently standing on a land bridge that connects Garden Key with its nearest neighbor, Bush Key. Now, historically, this land bridge did not exist. This was just an open channel between the 2 islands. However, over time, sand started to be deposited here. In year 2000 was the first time that a land bridge completely connected the 2. However, in the 2004-2005 hurricane season, a big hurricane came through and blew all this sand away, opening the channel once again. Slowly, the sand started to build again, and in 2012, the land bridge came back. And it's been that way ever since. However, due to human-made climate change, we'll never know when a big hurricane or a series of tropical storms might wash this land bridge away, or maybe one of the other smaller keys still remaining in the Dry Tortugas.
At the time Florida was acquired by the U.S., a major update to the nation's defenses was taking place. During the War of 1812, the British Navy had been able to make landfall and march their troops right into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the White House. The event demonstrated how much America lacked a proper coastal defense system. As a result, allocations were made to construct a series of highly fortified brick and masonry structures to defend America's coast and other important waterways. In this manner, a series of 42 forts were constructed between the years of 1816 and 1867.
Initial surveys of the Dry Tortugas advised against creating a fort here, and that was because of its isolated nature in the middle of the Gulf and the difficulty it would be to bring men and supplies all the way out here to build it. But also the keys weren't a great size for a fort. Even Garden Key, where Fort Jefferson was eventually built, is only 22 acres in size. Loggerhead Key, 3 miles to the west, was 49 acres and larger, and a lighthouse had been built there, but its elongated shape made it not suitable for a hexagonal-shaped fort. But soon, all the criticisms of building a fort in the middle of the Gulf were overruled by necessity. Both Florida and Texas became states in 1845, and so there was a need to protect this key trade route. Also, a war with Mexico soon followed because of the addition of these 2 states. Eventually, President Polk declared Garden Key a military reservation, and construction on the fort began in 1846. The design for what became Fort Jefferson had to be modified somewhat to fit on the small garden key. Rather than being a perfect hexagon, 2 of the 6 sides of the hexagonal plan had to be shortened somewhat in order to make an elongated hexagon fort. Here, in the Dry Tortugas Visitor Center in Key West, we can see a diorama of the fort as it looked during and after the Civil War years.
The design called for 3 tiers of gun emplacements, consisting of 420 heavy guns and howitzers. The fort itself was to have only a single entrance that was surrounded by a protective seawall and a 70-foot wide moat with a drawbridge. The inside of the fort was to hold soldiers' barracks for a garrison of 1,500 men, officers' quarters, multiple powder magazines, ammo stores, hot shot furnaces to heat cannonballs before firing them at enemy ships, a hospital, a navy store, kitchens, privies, a bakery, blacksmith shop, a carpentry shop, a chapel, an office structure, and more.
When construction began on Fort Jefferson, there really wasn't anything on Garden Key except for a lighthouse and a small lighthouse keeper's house. The lighthouse was located right here, and I'm on top of the foundation. It was a circular brick lighthouse, and it marked the entrance to the harbor. Now, in 1856, a much larger lighthouse was built over on Loggerhead Key, but this one continued to be in service. In the 1870s, a huge hurricane came through and knocked this lighthouse over. In 1875, this replacement lighthouse was made. Rather than being made of brick, it was made of iron and metal. Being durable and relatively lightweight, it could be placed atop one of the bastions. Now, just recently, this almost 150-year-old lighthouse was taken apart piece by piece and sent up north, where it was cleaned and carefully restored. Then it was brought back and put back together piece by piece, and now looks as good as new. The idea of fixing and having to rebuild parts of Fort Jefferson is not just part of the modern stewardship, but also was the constant refrain of the people working to construct it to begin with.
For the majority of its construction period, Fort Jefferson was built using the labor of the enslaved. The engineering corps rented enslaved men from their enslavers in Key West to do the bulk of the hard labor. Day in and day out, enslaved men dug out the fort's foundation, mixed mortar, and laid brick after brick in the broiling sun. Like many of America's greatest accomplishments, Fort Jefferson was only possible because of the exploitation of those held in bondage.
At the same time Fort Jefferson was being built in the Dry Tortugas, a smaller fort was similarly being built in Key West. This is Fort Zachary Taylor, essentially a smaller sister fort to Fort Jefferson. Like Fort Jefferson, it too was built using slave labor. These 2 fortification projects became a major source of income for Key West residents. Many enslavers moved to the Keys specifically to hire out their slaves to the federal government. Slave labor continued to be used at these forts even into the Civil War. It wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 that slave labor was no longer used at the forts.
The lead engineer here at Fort Taylor initially fought against the freeing of the enslaved, as he felt their labor was crucial for the fort's completion. It wasn't until 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect that the military district officially declared the end of slavery within the Keys and at Forts Taylor and Jefferson. Even after emancipation, however, much of the ongoing labor on these forts was still done by black laborers who were paid far less than their white counterparts.
Building this massive fort of 16 million bricks in the middle of the ocean was no small task. Construction was slow and fraught with delays. Bricks and supplies had to be shipped long distances, and the supply was never enough to meet the demand. Congress usually appropriated funds for the ongoing construction of Fort Jefferson, but that too was never enough to pay everything that needed to be done. There were long periods of time where constructions on the fort had to be paused or stopped entirely for weeks or even months at a time because of the lack of supplies and funding. Slowly by slowly, year by year, this massive fort rose from Garden Key. By 1860, it had reached here, the top terraplane level. It had taken 14 years to get to this point, and there were over 2,000 arches in the entire structure. But still, it was not complete. The exterior walls facing the ocean were not done, and none of the interior buildings were even made yet. However, there was a storm brewing on the horizon. The America that Fort Jefferson had been built to protect was fracturing over the issue of slavery. And so, before she was ready, Fort Jefferson would be called to war.
Captain Montgomery Meigs, the fort's new superintending engineer, arrived at Fort Jefferson on November 8, 1860, 2 days after the election which saw Abraham Lincoln win the presidency. During his trip from D.C. down to Florida, Meigs listened and observed firsthand the dangerous temper of the South. Key West was full of rumblings regarding the possible seizure of the 2 forts in the region, and a local pro-secessionist militia group started organizing and running drills right near the federal forces at Fort Taylor. Meigs immediately took steps to prepare Fort Jefferson for possible conflict. He closed up the many openings on the first floor and the temporary bridges over the moat that had been constructed. He also hastily constructed a drawbridge for the sole remaining entrance and exit at the Sally Port.
Florida seceded from the Union on January 10, 1861. On a subsequent visit to Key West, Meigs learned that other southern forts had been attacked and even taken over. He knew how vulnerable Fort Jefferson was. At that time, there was no military presence here, only 80 residents and workers. They only had about half a dozen guns to their names, and these were just hunting rifles used to shoot birds on the nearby keys. But worst of all, this huge fortification had no cannons. Each of the over 400 cannon embrasures like this were completely empty.
On the morning of January 18th, Meigs and his small group of workers sighted a large steamer approaching the Tortugas. The steamer flew no flag, and the group anxiously watched as a small boat was launched from the steamer and made its way across the harbor towards the fort.
All were relieved to find that the steamship contained Major Lewis Arnold and 66 men with the 2nd U.S. Artillery, who had come to occupy and, if need be, defend Fort Jefferson. But they were still without cannons, and so Captain Meigs took a ship back to Key West. And he took from Fort Taylor 6 heavy cannons and 4 artillery pieces and brought them back to the fort. By the morning of January 25th, the artillerist had mounted the 6 guns in the corner bastions, and now Fort Jefferson could defend itself. The military presence at Fort Jefferson steadily increased. By March of 1862, over 1,000 soldiers were stationed here. The fort was now well fortified with cannon, shells, cannonballs, and other ammunition, examples of which are shown here at the exhibit building. However, unlike other southern forts, which saw attacks from the Confederacy, Forts Jefferson and Taylor remained in Union hands throughout the war. The Confederacy never made an effort to attack these strongholds on the Florida Keys. As a result, Fort Jefferson became a safe harbor for Union ships attempting to blockade the South. No hostile guns were ever directed at Fort Jefferson.